We're trying to wind down this series looking at a lot of Old Testament stories, and we're getting close to the end. We're going to look at the story of Elijah today from First Kings, mostly from First Kings 18 and 19. There's some other places as well, and it's called the One True God because everything in Elijah's story points back to Jehovah, the one true God. So we're going to talk about who Elijah is. First, he's a prophet that God used to call out wicked leaders. We're introduced to him in 1 Kings 17. It says Elijah the Tishbite from the Gilead settlers. That's really all we know about him. That's all the background that we know. We don't know much about him, about his family, about his background, any of that kind of stuff. But his name means the Lord is my God, and his life matches up to that. his work, what he's known for is being a great prophet that God used to call out wicked leaders, to warn them, to condemn them for the evil things that they were doing. And also we know that God took great care of him. There were ravens that fed him. There was a poor widow woman who seemed to have an endless supply of food when he stayed with her, and she took him in, and God really took care of him. Second thing we know about him, he was part of a lot of miracles, several miracles. Before Elijah, kings trembled. The rain stopped. A jug of oil never ran dry. The widow's son came back to life. He was raised from the dead. Fire fell from the sky. Revival broke out. Hundreds of idolatrous prophets of Baal were executed. He was fed by ravens. He saw God multiply the widow's food, as we talked about. He's part of the rain coming back and the drought ending. He's part of calling fire down from heaven multiple times. God used him in a lot of different ways, and even the end of his life, he was taken away in a miraculous manner. We'll come back to that in a minute. He also was a mentor for another prophet, Elisha. At the end of chapter 19 and beyond, we see him taking on Elisha, eventually passing the torch to him, kind of mentoring him, raising him up. As he found out that his life was coming to an end, that his time was coming to an end, he told Elisha and prepared him for it. And Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's what Elijah had. And Elijah said, if you see me when I'm taken, you'll get this. And that happened. And afterwards, he performed the same miracle of parting water and so forth. And he kind of picked up Elijah's mantle and carried it on. And then the final thing is that his life ended dramatically. In 2 Kings 2:11, he's called up to heaven in a fiery chariot. Imagine being there. Imagine that scene if you were one of the people on the scene. Elijah said, what can I do for you before I'm taken? He said he wanted a double portion of the Spirit. He said, if you see me when I'm taken, then this chariot of fire comes, and Elijah goes up in the chariot in a whirlwind, and it's just this crazy thing. Elisha goes on to champion the same message of following God Almighty. So there's a couple of stories that I want us to look at more specifically, and they're found in 1 Kings 18 and 19. The first is an encounter on Mount Carmel. Elijah challenged Ahab to a contest between Baal and God. After a long time, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year. Go present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the surface of the land. Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria. Goes on. And it says eventually, it says that Elijah challenges him. He says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. The people didn't answer. Elijah said, I am the only remaining prophet, but Baal's are 450 men. Let two bulls be given to us. They're to choose a bull for themselves, cut it to pieces, place it on the wood, but not light the fire. I will prepare the other, place it on the wood, but not light the fire. You call the name of your God, I'll call the name of the Lord, the God who answers with fire. He is God. The people answered. The people agreed. So after years without rain, God says the rain's going to come. He calls for Elijah to tell them to come back to him. It doesn't happen, and so he calls this national contest on Mount Carmel. It's one person versus 850. It's Elijah and God versus 150, or 850 rather. It's Elijah and God versus the priests and false prophets of the false gods Baal and Asherah and all this stuff. He issues this challenge. He says, build an altar, put the bull on it, and see which God shows up and sets it on fire. Well, Baal never showed up, obviously. I mean, they spent hours and hours of crying out in vain, cutting themselves, yelling for Baal to show up. Elijah even kind of trash talks him a little bit along the way. He says things like, well, maybe your God's sitting on the toilet. And eventually, after hours and hours of this, Elijah takes the bull, covers the altar with water, and fills everything around it. God comes and burns everything, including the water, up with fire. The fire of God falls down. It consumes the burnt offering. It consumes the wood, the stones, the dust, and even licks up the water that's in the trench. He shows up in a huge way. The false prophets are defeated, and the drought is over. God shows up. He burns everything in this spectacular manner. Everything Elijah did was for the glory of God, was to point to God. And in this particular scenario, he doesn't just dominate the false prophets, he destroys them in a lot of ways. He has them killed ultimately. A cloud forms, the rain begins, a heavy rain falls, and the drought is over by the end of chapter 18. So we get over to chapter 19, and God has shown up in this huge way in chapter 18. Ahab, the wicked king, tells his wife Jezebel everything Elijah's done and how he had killed the prophets. Jezebel sent a messenger, says, "May the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Basically threatens his life. Within 24 hours, you're going to be dead. And Elijah's scared. He's depressed. He's ready to throw in the towel. It says he became afraid and immediately ran for his life, left his servant there, went a day's journey in the wilderness, settles down under a broom tree, prays that he might die. He says, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I'm no better than my teachers." Lays down and sleeps. Twice an angel shows up, gives him food, all that kind of stuff. He flees into the wilderness. He collapses under a tree. He's exhausted. He's depressed. He's anxious. He's lonely. He's panicky. He's begging for God to take his life before these false prophets can, before Jezebel can, before the king and queen can take his life. He is extremely depressed. He wants to give in. He wants to die. He's tired of feeling like he's the only one. He's tired of thinking he's the only one. He's tired of believing he's the only one. We find out later, by the way, towards the end of chapter 19, that there's more followers. There's 7,000 followers. In verse 18, "I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that is not bowed to Baal and every mouth that is not kissed him." So he's not really alone, but in the moment he thinks he is. He's scared, depressed, ready to throw in the towel. But God gets a hold of him. The angel takes care of him, says, "Get up and eat. The journey will be too much." He gets up, eats and drinks, walks 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He enters a cave there and spends the night. God comes and says, "What are you doing here? I've been very zealous for the Lord God of armies, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, tore down your altars, killed your prophets. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life." God says, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." So he gives him a specific request. He's taken care of him. He's renewed him through the angel, through food, through rest, all these kinds of things. And he sends him out with a powerful demonstration of his power. It says, a great and mighty wind, or it says, "At that moment the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord is not in the wind. After the wind there's an earthquake, but the Lord is not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" God shows up through that gentle whisper. He obeys, he listens, he understands that God is not finished with him yet. Time and time again, Elijah sets an example of obedience to God, and God shows up to him in this gentle whisper. He's again, going back to the beginning of the chapter, he's fled, he believes he's going to be killed, he's depressed, the angel takes care of him. He reaches the mountain, and God speaks to him, not in the mighty and brilliant stuff, but in the gentle whisper. Gives him new tasks, gives him a clear idea that God is not finished with him yet. He shows up and speaks to Elijah in this gentle whisper. God will show up in the big things. He did it in chapter 18, but it'll also show up in the day-to-day. He'll also show up in the mundane and the stuff that's not as big and maybe not as significant in our minds, the gentle whispers. He does that for Elijah. He'll do it for us. So 3 questions we need to ask ourselves. Will I faithfully follow God even when others fall astray? Elijah is one person. There's 850 prophets of Baal, priests of Baal and Asherah and all this stuff, and he's still faithfully following God. Secondly, will I consistently listen for the voice of God? He did. Even though he's depressed, anxious, exhausted, all these things, once his life taken, he's listening for the voice of God. And we need to do the same thing. Listen in that still small voice. Listen for that still small voice. And then the third thing, will I trust God in the day-to-day as well as in the big things? Sometimes we just want the huge events, the big moments. In churches, sometimes it's a revival or a mission trip or a huge attendance or whatever. But will we trust God in the day-to-day, the routine, the mundane, the 168 hours in a week, the 24/7 life? Will we trust him in that? Elijah trusted God. He lived obediently for him, consistently for him. Everything in his life points to God. He learned to listen to the voice of God. He learned to obey God. And a lot of times we don't do that. We don't tune our ears. We don't turn our hearts in silence to him. We don't make room for him beyond a night at youth group on Wednesday or maybe at church on Sunday or here and there otherwise. The people who hear God are the people who make room for God. The people who listen to him, tune their ears to him. He wants to meet us in our personal space. He wants to meet us in our day-to-day. He's not too busy. In fact, he invites us. He wants to meet with us one-on-one. He wants to take us in our most pressing of situations. He might show up in the big things, but he'll definitely speak in the quiet whispers where we are in our daily lives and our situations. Will we listen? Will we hear him? Will we trust him? Will we obey him?